Good evening. Welcome to this, the 40th anniversary celebration of the Gerald R. Ford Museum, Library, and Foundation. I'm Mike Ford, the eldest of Jerry and Betty Ford's 4 children, and the chair of the Ford Presidential Foundation. I think we can all agree that our nation is going through some tough times presently. The fact that this event is coming to you virtually instead of in person is just one telling sign. Other signs are the degree to which the American people are divided or feel divided, how their distrust expresses itself with our national leaders and their lack of real confidence in our public institutions. In the face of these challenging realities, what is to be our response as a foundation and individually? Following the lead of my father and mother, our Ford Presidential Foundation has chosen not to surrender to cynicism or defeatism or despair. For me personally, I think about my father and his legacy, great legacy of strong and principled and compassionate leadership during some very turbulent years for our nation and for our world. I believe that he would desire the Ford Presidential Foundation to move forward, to show national leadership, and to step into the public space of developing programs and initiatives that reflect and promote several core principles. The first principle, a spirit of civility that includes mutual respect and dignity for all people. Second, an open-minded dialogue that includes deep listening to one another toward understanding. Third, the practice of working together across differences to find common ground and solutions to solve our shared problems for the common good. Fourth, empathy and compassion for all members of society. And fifth, honor and integrity in how we approach all relationships and how we do our work. Through our world-class events, educational programs, and civic initiatives, we here at the Ford seek to bring light into the darkness. At the present, the lights are out. The National Archives has closed the museum, the library, and the foundation because of COVID. But the Ford, in our broadest understanding, is more than a building. And in a very real sense, it cannot be closed or linger and idle in the darkness. That's because we are inheritors of a set of ideas and values that call forth the very best of the American experience. We draw wisdom and strength from my father and mother's lives and legacies, from their core principles, and from their courageous examples of facing uncertain and challenging times. I believe that the Ford has a calling, indeed a mandate, to play a meaningful and significant role in providing civic leadership and service to help educate, inspire, heal, and restore our great Commonwealth of America. Thank you for joining me and the Gerald Ford Foundation in this very important mission and work. And now I'm going to throw myself to my executive director, Gleaves Whitney of the Ford Presidential Foundation. Gleaves?
Thank you, Mike, for welcoming our audience and kicking off the 40th anniversary celebration of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, Library, and Museum. Your powerful message reminds us of your parents' great civic legacy that inspires the work we do. I can think of no better way to kick off our 40th anniversary than by hosting tonight's two guests, Richard Norton Smith and Hank Meyer. Richard and Hank have long been part of President and Mrs. Ford's story and legacy. In addition to being friends themselves, they each are biographers and historians in their own right who expertly join the craft of research with the art of writing. Both are extraordinarily patient writers, willing to play the long game, spending years to get their subjects right. Richard has written definitive biographies of Tom Dewey, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, of Colonel McCormick, and most recently of Nelson Rockefeller. For the past 8 years, he has been working on the definitive biography of President Ford, a book from what I've seen so far that will deliver a brilliantly illuminated and honestly evaluated picture of the Fords. It's a re-examination of their outward achievements in light of their inner strengths and struggles and secrets. Hank has also written definitive biographies, fine biographies of Hendrik Meyer and more recently Arthur Vandenberg, published by the University of Chicago Press. More biographies are sure to come, but I'll let Hank decide whether he wants to reveal his current project. But it too promises to peel back the veneer of its subject and get at the core of a fascinating human being. Since Hank has read most of the chapters in Richard's book in draft form, he has a perspective on the work that the rest of us lack. He will put a few questions to Richard about some of the surprising things he's learned about Gerald R. Ford, things that transcend the traditional narratives that we've all come to accept and assume are complete. They're not. Now, that segment of our program will go about 45 minutes or so, after which we will entertain questions from our large and appreciative Zoom audience. Please submit your questions on the screen there in your chat or Q&A function. Well, with our introductory material behind us, I'd now like to pitch it to Hank to start us off. Hank, take it away.
Well, Gleaves, thank you so much. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening, Richard. Richard, as someone who grew up in Grand Rapids, Gerald Ford was my congressman from the time I was born until I graduated from college. I knew no one else representing us in the House of Representatives, and I felt like I knew Gerald Ford. From the Red Flannel Day parade in Cedar Springs to 4th of July on Michigan Street, there he was, waving to the crowd. There he was, meeting us at school events and every place you could imagine. But reading your book, I realized that I didn't know Gerald Ford at all. And when we talk about the surprising thing about Gerald Ford, there's a lot of surprising things, but I wonder where you start. What are the most surprising themes that came to you as you worked on this project?
Well, Hank, first of all, thanks. I would say you did know Gerald Ford, but qualify that by saying that there's more than one Gerald Ford. And I think the mistake that history and certainly journalists in his own time tended to make, they tended to take him at face value. You know, how many times did you hear what you see is what you get? Or even the almost condescending use of the word decency, as if somehow that was a substitute for political sophistication or vision. And what I've discovered over the last 8 years, I thought I knew President Ford pretty well. And I've discovered a lot of things that I didn't know. And I think maybe some things he didn't want us to know. He was much more ambitious. From an early 1960, he was actively campaigning to be Richard Nixon's running mate. You know, they were old friends, and he was actually considered as something more than a dark horse. The question about the surprises, which is inseparable from the legacy, in effect, and there are two ways to answer that, sort of macro and micro. So let me look at the big picture, the historical, what's surprising. The biggest surprise, first of all, is that Gerald Ford is a much more consequential president. He's not a caretaker. He is not, in my opinion, someone who should be understood primarily as the end of the Nixon administration, sort of a coda to 1972. And I would go out on a limb and say that I think President Ford understated his historical accomplishments when he emphasized healing the nation. Important as that was, restoring an element of trust in our government. That was obviously hugely important and a real challenge. And for that, he deserves to be remembered. What I would argue is that he started much more than we credit him, that he changed much more than we assume. A couple examples. Domestically, in 1946, the Depression generation understandably passed legislation that basically said the economic policy of the United States is to place primary emphasis on fighting unemployment. Inflation was a secondary factor. 30 years later, Gerald Ford found himself in a unique situation. The first president to confront what we call stagnation, where unemployment was up and prices were galloping at double-digit levels, double-digit interest rates, unprecedented combination. And Ford, from the beginning, broke with that 30-year convention to make it very clear that while he would fight unemployment, and he did a number of things, he believed that inflation was the number one danger that the country faced economically. And the interesting thing is, again, Ford is the first of a series of presidents. When you think of the Carter administration, obviously the Reagan administration, but Bill Clinton's talking about the era of big government is over. That you can trace back in many ways to the 1970s and to the Ford presidency. Deregulation, which we all take for granted. Today, talk to a young person, they cannot conceive of a time when the federal government told airlines when they were going to fly, where they were going to fly to, what trucking prices would be, where railroads could operate. There were no ATM machines. Credit unions didn't offer mortgages. I mean, all of that is something that we've sort of forgotten or we laugh at. The fact of the matter is, all of that changed because Gerald Ford was the first president to take on the regulatory establishment, and it became the norm. The Carter administration completed airline and trucking deregulation, which began in the Ford administration. It's become a bipartisan cause. Okay, look at the world scene. Something called the Helsinki Accords in 1975 were widely criticized from the right and the left, but particularly from the right. Gerald Ford went to Helsinki with 35 European nations, including the Soviet Union, and signed the Helsinki Accords, which on the face of it accepted post-World War II boundaries, i.e. the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. However, Gerald Ford exacted a high price for participating in the Helsinki Conference. There had to be progress on Berlin. Again, we forget 60 years ago, we almost went to nuclear war over divided Berlin. And there was progress, major progress on Berlin. But beyond that, Gerald Ford insisted the price of his participation in the Helsinki Conference would be a very significant addition to the agenda, and that was the subject of human rights. And if you look at the Helsinki Accords and the long-term consequences, the human rights watches that were established behind the Iron Curtain in country after country, today Helsinki is seen as a major milestone on the road to the end of the Soviet Union, obviously, and the liberation of Eastern Europe. It's a good example. It's a very good example of why Ford doesn't get the credit. I mean, today we sort of take it for granted. It's hard to think back to the 1960s and 70s to a divided planet. And at the time, he not only didn't get the credit, but it probably was a significant factor contributing to Ronald Reagan's early successes in the 1976 campaign. So there are a few examples of where on the macro level, the Ford administration profoundly affected the way we have lived since and the way we live today. On the micro level, there's just countless examples of surprising, one very small, very personal thing. I'm the first person, just by luck of the draw, because this material only recently became available, to see Gerald Ford's baby book. And there's a particularly poignant passage, baby's first automobile journey. It happened to take place 2 weeks after the child was born, 2 days after his father, probably under the influence of alcohol, walked into the bedroom with a butcher knife, threatening to kill both his wife and infant son. And 2 days later, Dorothy Gardner King, then a remarkable woman, slipped out of the house, and baby's first automobile ride was across the bridge from Omaha, Nebraska to Iowa, from where they took the train to Chicago, where she found refuge under her sister's roof. That's just one. The the Kings were divorced very shortly after. And Junie Ford, as he was known here in Grand Rapids, Junior King, his father was ordered to pay child support, which he never did. And Gerald Ford is elected to Congress in 1948. One of the first bills he introduces would federalize child support payments. And you think about it, in 1949, that was not an idea that was widely embraced. Here's the remarkable coincidence. Over and over in this project, I find myself coming full circle. In 1975, beginning of 75, Ford had only been in the White House a few months. He signs a piece of legislation, which is basically an updated version of the bill that he filed in 1949. And what sets him apart, again, from every other politician I can think of, is he never mentions his own experience. He does not exploit it for emotional or political gain. He simply signs the legislation and has the satisfaction of knowing that, presumably millions of mothers will not have to experience what his mother experienced.
And you could probably even draw that line to 1975 and the fall of Saigon and the orphans coming in.
Yeah, the drama, it's a good thing you raised that, because there's this popular notion of Gerald Ford, good old Jerry, kind of vanilla, Midwest, good guy, decent guy, but not particularly dramatic. Well, I can tell you, and from reading the text, it's a remarkably dramatic life. Until he went to college, he didn't know whether he was Junior King or Junior Ford. And years later, Mike will appreciate this, when it came time to name their first child, Ford said anything but Junior, no juniors. And one census, he probably got sick of being called Junie, which was his childhood name. The remarkable thing is that it doesn't seem to have left emotional scars I mean, if anyone coming out of a quote broken home was sort of entitled to be in some ways broken himself, but it didn't happen with Ford. The drama of April 1975, it's a real challenge to do justice to it. There are chapters in this book that have gone through 40 to 50 drafts, and that's one of them, because it is a story that, well, it's an incredibly complicated story. One of the things that I was naive. I run 5 presidential libraries, and I was not prepared for the sheer amount of documentation that the modern presidency generates. There is more paper in the Gerald Ford Library in Ann Arbor than there is in the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, which, when you stop to think about it, is pretty remarkable. When I was director, one of the things we did for the 25th anniversary of the fall of Saigon was, and this is again separates President Ford from some of his fellow members in the exclusive trade union of former presidents. He went to the head of the CIA and said, can we open as much material? I mean, traditionally presidents tend to do the exact opposite, but not President Ford. And it was, he said, it was the most humiliating moment of his presidency, to sit in the Oval Office and watch us in effect be ejected from Indochina after all of the blood and sacrifice and treasure that had been spent there. So it is an amazing story. There was about 40,000 pages that we released at that point. Well, I feel like I've looked at all of those and then some. And that's why this story kept rewriting itself in some ways. I would happen upon things. One day, classic example, I was looking at Phil Buchan's papers. Now, Phil Buchan is a name that should be well known in Grand Rapids. I found out a lot of things about Phil Buchan that I didn't know. He's a much more complicated, pivotal figure. President Ford referred to him as his conscience. Well, anyway, I'm looking through the papers, and a scrap of paper so big, handwritten, falls out. It's 2 days after the pardon. He's writing a note to the president. Leon Jaworski called to say what a great job you did in the press conference, and in effect endorsed what Ford did with the Nixon pardon. One of the things that I've discovered in doing this book is that we don't know the whole story of Watergate. And one of the things we probably haven't concentrated on is just how reluctant Leon Jaworski was to indict Richard Nixon personally. I mean, he was under a lot of pressure from people in the special prosecutor's office, but I think he was pushing back. And it raises the question that we'll never be able to answer. Did Gerald Ford have to pardon Richard Nixon? Might Leon Jaworski, in fact, have let him off the hook? One of the extraordinary things I found were notes for a diary that was never kept by Phil Buchan's wife, Bunny. And it's a contemporary diary at the time of the pardon, which means for the first time, we can hear and read the exact word-for-word exchanges between her husband and the president as he explains why he wants to go ahead with the pardon. And one of the reasons was that he did not want to saddle Leon Jaworski with the exclusive responsibility of deciding whether or not to prosecute Richard Nixon. So, I mean, I am surprised, and I don't say this in a kind of promotional way, I am surprised at how much I learned that I didn't know, or that surprised me about things that I thought I did know. Watergate is a good example. Vietnam and the fall of Saigon. There are conversations, verbatim conversations, in the middle of the night between the president and Henry Kissinger. And you have to remember there'd been a big ongoing fight within the administration between Jim Schlesinger, the Secretary of Defense, who wanted to pull the plug as soon as possible, and who frankly did not care how many Vietnamese we got out. He basically just wanted to have it over with and to bring out Americans, and that would be the end of, in effect, of our moral obligation. Kissinger, and even more Ford, took a very different viewpoint. And I think you could argue Ford's finest hour as president came in the aftermath of the fall of Saigon, when, against public sentiment, he used the bully pulpit of the presidency to, in effect, shame Congress. Congress wanted to pull up the ladder and say, thank God we're out of there. And Ford said, well, wait a second, we didn't do that when the Hungarians were looking for asylum after the Hungarian Revolution. We didn't do it when the Cubans were fleeing Castro's tyranny. And he said, damn it, we're not going to do it now. And he made a difference. If he hadn't done what he did, you would not have had 125,000 Vietnamese refugees in the first wave come to this country. And of course, those numbers have been greatly increased in the years since. But that's, again, it's another slice of the story that people don't know much about.
And you had, Gleaves mentioned secrets, and you mentioned that he didn't seem to be emotionally scarred by what was an incredibly traumatic infancy, if you will, and young adolescence. And yet, maybe there's a little bit of propensity for secrets and discretion that grew out of that you trace.
No, I think so. Look, Gerald Ford made a career out of being underestimated. Something, by the way, you could say about Ronald Reagan in politics. In politics, there are a lot worse things than being underestimated. And I think Ford, and I don't want to use the word guile because it's loaded, shrewd, observant, a little tiny thing. We all know he smoked a pipe. What we don't know is he used the pipe as a prop. If he wanted to delay answering a question, if he wanted to prolong the discussion, the pipe was a perfect way to do it. He also, I said he was observant. Wonderful, literally it's a footnote, but it's a revealing footnote. He noticed the difference, the psychological difference between pipe smokers and cigar smokers. And it's a small thing, but it goes to the heart of what I'm getting at. That this man is a lot more complicated, dare I say, a lot more substantive. It's not well known. Before he met Mrs. Ford, there was a very serious relationship. He spent more time at Yale than at the University of Michigan, both as a coach and then, of course, Yale Law School. And he took up with a young woman. The words cover model, supermodel, and Gerald Ford don't seem to belong in the same sentence. But one of the surprises is that Gerald Ford's first serious girlfriend was, in fact, a supermodel. And she introduced him to the theater in New York. She taught him to ski and to play bridge. They discovered that they both had a love for the somewhat clotted prose of Thomas Wolfe, Look Homeward Angel, and the like. And it was a very serious relationship, but it ended. And it ended because she didn't want to leave New York and live in Grand Rapids. And he, on his own, concluded, I think he was already interested in going to politics. And he decided this probably was not the life for that kind of life. And in fact, Phyllis went on to have 3 husbands. Late in life, she was interviewed by Jim Cannon, a predecessor of mine, as a Ford biographer, good friend. good friend of the president's, who I think sometimes pulled his punches just a little bit. It's a good thing he did, because he told me the stories that he didn't tell. And a great example, he went to interview. The name of Phyllis was one you didn't mention around the Ford household. Let's just say that. And but anyway, Jim went to interview her in Reno, appropriately, and he got to the airport and he thought, well, how am I going to ingratiate myself with this woman? So he stopped at a floral stand and bought a dozen red roses. And he went to her apartment and knocked on the door. She opened the door and he said, here, President Ford wanted you to have these. And she immediately laughed in his face. No, he didn't. He said, he never wanted me to have flowers. and from there, they talked for the rest of the day. And I will let this cat out of the bag. At the end. Now you got to remember, at this point, Gerald Ford is probably in his mid-80s, and Phyllis was 7 or 8 years younger. And so she says to Jim Cannon, will you take a message to him? And he says, sure. And she says, would you tell him, Jerry, I still think about you. I still dream about you. I still love you. And what do you do with a message like that? And so Cannon went back to Rancho Mirage and he found the right time and place, if there is a right time and place. And he repeated the message. And there was this pause. And he thought, gee, I've really gone over the line here. But no, Gerald Ford was thinking what he was going to say. And what he said was, he said, well, she was quite a gal. But then he said, but Betty and I have had such a wonderful life. He didn't have to finish the sentence. I thought, there he got 2 compliments into the same incomplete sentence. I mean, that's a politician. But again, it's the sort of thing that hasn't shown up in other books.
And in a less romantic and glamorous way, but she also introduced him to the East Coast in a sense, and to Wendell Willkie, and may have been a part of his incipient growth in his way he looked at the world.
It's really interesting. A lot of people don't know. Gerald Ford was one of the 4 people at Yale Law School who started America First. Potter Stewart, future Supreme Court justice, was another. And it's very interesting because at the same time, and you have to remember what America First in its original form was, there was a whole generation of college kids who looked back at World War I and saw the disillusionment that followed and thought, do we want to repeat that experience? Well, the interesting thing is Ford quit America First before it sort of went public. And I have a couple theories. One is he got very interested in Wendell Willkie's candidacy. And for those who remember or know about Wendell Willkie, he was certainly not an isolationist. He was a former Democrat, a Woodrow Wilson Democrat, who agreed with Franklin Roosevelt on Lend-Lease and basically on aid to the Churchill government, which at this point was, Ford said at one point he was driving and Churchill's famous blood, tears, toil, and sweat speech was being broadcast transatlantic on the radio. And Ford said, I almost drove off the road. And he parked and listened to the rest of the speech. And he said he was almost in tears. What I then discovered, 2 things was, first of all, unknown until now, he had, through his father, gone to Senator Vandenberg in an effort to get a naval commission. So here you have Gerald Ford, who on the one hand is campaigning against American participation in a European war, but simultaneously is trying to enroll in the Navy to be part of whatever national defense or offense may come. Subsequently, after Pearl Harbor, he, needless to say, signed up for the Navy. But before that, he had also applied to be an FBI agent. Gerald Ford wanted to be an FBI agent. And I've got the documents from the local office. They said, this is the best applicant we have seen in years. And the supporting paperwork bears that out. I mean, it's glowing. And he waited and he waited and he didn't hear anything back. And he finally wrote to the Bureau and he got a letter from J. Edgar Hoover, who had personally, didn't tell him, personally pulled the plug on Gerald Ford's application to be an FBI agent. And Gerald Ford, I believe, went to his grave thinking that the reason he wasn't an FBI agent was because of his gimpy football needs. It was a physical matter. In fact, again, I have the documentation, an informant in New Haven had gone to the FBI and told them about Ford's involvement with America First. And J. Edgar Hoover personally terminated Ford's application. The great irony, of course, is when Ford gets to Congress, one of the first things he calls for is to give J. Edgar Hoover a raise. And of course, Ford is a mainstay of the Warren Commission, and there's great controversy over the relationship that he had with the FBI. And anyway, it's a story that goes on and on in surprising ways.
Look, and particularly for local people in our audience, I was intrigued to read about Ford's first meeting with Richard Nixon when they're both young politicians on the rise at Ford's parents' house in East Grand Rapids.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I wish someone would put a plaque on the Old Row Hotel, which of course has been redeveloped. The ballroom is gone now, but in that hotel in 1951, Congressman Gerald Ford, it was the annual Lincoln Day dinner. And Arthur Vandenberg, as you know well, couldn't be there. He was dying literally up the street at his house. So Gerald Ford was presiding. He just won his second term in the House and was seen very much as a comer. So he had to come up with a speaker. Well, he came up with newly elected California Senator Richard Nixon. And they'd had a passing acquaintance during the previous couple of years. But that trip was the first chance. Everybody was impressed with Nixon. At one point, the lights went out. Well, I mean, you can imagine for any speaker, that's got to be the ultimate nightmare. And Nixon very deftly made a joke out of it, And after the meeting, there was a small group. Nixon was a controversial figure, of course, because of his involvement with the Alger hiss. I mean, it was both the case that catapulted him to national recognition and made enemies that, were with him for the rest of his life. And it was really interesting because Ford had Nixon sit down with the sort of cream of the crop of the local Republican establishment, and they fired questions at him. And he was really impressed at how skillfully Nixon, and then the evening, they didn't want the evening to end. So it turned out there was some sort of military occasion, and they went over to that. And he saw Nixon more relaxed than he ever saw him before or after. And finally, at midnight, they go to the house, his parents' house. His folks are out of town. His mother later on put up a sign over the bed that said, the vice president slept here. And in the morning, Ford drove Nixon to the airport. And it really was the beginning of a historic relationship, and a relationship that is still hotly debated, and that I think this book will explore. Remember, in '62, when Nixon lost the governorship of California, ABC, with questionable taste, put on a half-hour program called The Political Obituary of Richard M. Nixon, hosted by Howard K. Smith, with guests including Alger Hiss. And it's really interesting. Nixon never forgot the one Republican who would go on the program and defend him and argue that his political career was not necessarily over because he lost the governorship, was Gerald Ford. And at the end of his presidency, it's really interesting when they were basically arranging the details of the transfer of power. Nixon volunteered the observation, maybe because it was easier to talk about than the here and now, but he had never forgotten, who his friends were. The sad thing, of course, is the pardon. There's a lot of new information about the pardon, and a lot of it deals surprisingly with Grand Rapids and the role that people in Grand Rapids actually had, completely unknown to the general public until this time. But I think the pardon, in a way that you, I guess, can understand, the relationship was never really the same after that.
Well, and when you talk about the Grand Rapids connection, that goes everything from the junior lawyers at Warner Norcross and Judd investigating the precedents for the pardon to
Duncan Little
at Fountain Street
Duncan
Church.
Little Fair, who of course his critics called Duncan Little Faith.
Yes.
Duncan Little Fair was, shall we say, a non-creedal Christian who boasted about the fact that he had never talked about the supernatural except in what he said was a poetic sense. Well, the fact is, again, here's a surprise. Phil Buchan and Duncan Little Fair were the best of friends. Phil Buchan wrote a 3-volume history of the Fountain Street Church. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but let's just say Duncan Little Fair plays a surprising role in the drama of the Nixon pardon. But speaking of local, I have to say, people don't, Gerald Ford's entry into politics simultaneously with his father, who was the head of the Republican county committee, was because of Frank McKay, a name that, again, is probably largely forgotten on the streets of Grand Rapids today. But there was a time when Frank McKay, I would argue for the worse, pretty much ran this town. And indeed, there are those who'd say ran the state of Michigan. He had enormous influence. He had at least a couple governors who were eating out of his hand. One book has been published that credibly suggests he was involved in the murder of a state senator whose offense was to go before a grand jury and testify against Frank McKay and the McKay organization. And the senator never made it back to the grand jury. He was murdered in an isolated stretch of highway. And to this day, no one has ever been convicted of the crime. But Frank McKay is a fascinating figure in and of himself. It's a great and very surprising window on Grand Rapids at a not that distant period in our history. This was a swinging town. It may have been Dutch, but it was also it had a red light district and a thoroughly corrupt management.
Oh, and it was an act of some political courage for young Gerald Ford and his father to take on Frank McKay. That was not lightly done.
His father bought a revolver and kept it under his pillow until Dorothy, his wife, said, "Put it somewhere that I won't be." So he found a board in the attic and put it under that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, after Senator Hoover died, there was no shortage of people who thought that Frank McKay was capable of virtually anything
Yeah.
Particularly at this point, his power was on the decline. And how many times have you heard it said that, an animal backed into a corner is a whole lot more dangerous than any other kind. But McKay is of course, McKay Tower. The great story about when Ford first ran for Congress, the best odds he could get were 3-1 against him. Nobody thought, including Betty Warren, who said, well, it's a Dutch town, and Bartel Jonkman is about as Dutch as they come. She didn't think he would win. And the great story about he had no money. And so he really had to scrounge for publicity. Well, he got the Quonset hut set up in the parking lot, conveniently enough, within sight of Frank McKay's tower. And McKay went through the roof. And it was an illustration of the limits of McKay's power. McKay picked up the phone and called Ford's law firm, figuring he could push buttons and pull strings and get the Quonset hut removed. And he found out that he couldn't. And Ford went on to win that race 2-1 and never looked back.
Well, and just to bring it up to the present day, we have, I was impressed with how President Ford grew in the office, and someone without, for example, without a great deal of experience in international affairs. And you talk about his handling of the Mayaguez incident, and then further from there. And maybe that would be a good place to be before we run out of time to talk about his own growth.
Well, and that's absolutely a valid point. There were people who thought that he couldn't function without Henry Kissinger. And the really interesting thing is the story of the Ford presidency, in many ways, is growing to the point where he didn't need Kissinger. He had enormous respect for Kissinger. Kissinger always was, without a doubt, the leading foreign policy figure in the administration. But you remember, Ford had spent 25 years on Capitol Hill, most of that time on the defense subcommittee of appropriations. So one of the reasons why he frankly didn't get along with Jim Schlesinger at the Pentagon was Schlesinger made the mistake, which other people made as well, of condescending to Ford. Good old Jerry, I have to explain things to him. Well, what he didn't know was Gerald Ford knew that defense budget probably better than Jim Schlesinger did. And Kissinger shrewdly never made that mistake. And so 2 weeks after the fall of Saigon, there's a real doubt about the future of America's role in the world and American influence, not just in Southeast Asia, but globally. And then along comes the Mayaguez, the sort of ragtag, what passed for government in Cambodia, the forerunner of the Khmer Rouge, the murderous thugs who took over Cambodia. They basically seized an American cargo vessel. And it was the first sort of great test. Well, Saigon obviously had been a test, but it was an opportunity for Ford to demonstrate, first of all, in getting the ship and, most important, its crew back safely, that the United States had not been cowed by the undeniable humiliation of Saigon. And so it's interesting. People talk about when he signed the pardon, his numbers went down 22 points. It was the single biggest overnight drop in the history of the presidency. After we got the Mayaguez back, his numbers went up 12 points, which is one of the largest improvements in the history. So for Gerald Ford, the presidency was, in many ways, was a roller coaster. And a roller coaster ride, by its very nature, is it's many things, but it's not dull.
Indeed. Well, I want to leave time for questions for from some of our listeners, and there have been a number of good ones. And um, Steve Waterbury asked, Gerald Ford was an Eagle Scout. Is there anything in your book about the importance of his scouting experience in Gerald Ford's life?
There is. He thought it was one of the most important aspects. And I'll give you one specific example. Gerald Ford said the one thing he inherited from his birth father was temper. And here's a factoid. His mother, well aware of the shortcoming in her son, read a particular passage from the Bible about, in effect, he that controls his temper is mightier than he that takes cities. I'm ruining the quote. The reason I mention it is it's the exact same biblical quote that Dwight Eisenhower's mother used to cite to him because he had the exact same problem. And like Ike, Gerald Ford learned to govern himself before he governed others. And the place really where that football was important, college was important, but he attributed his experience as a scout and an Eagle Scout. And in fact, early signs of leadership. The governor of Michigan, Fred Green by name, in 1929, the very first class of scouts, Eagle Scouts, who drew the assignment, enviable assignment, of spending the summer up at Fort Mackinac, where they greeted tourists and conducted tours, and in the meantime got to enjoy a summer on the island. Well, Gerald Ford was one of that very small, half a dozen, 6 or 8, who were selected by the governor of Michigan. That tells you something about the swath he was already cutting as a scout.
Thank you. Now, Gleaves, I'll defer to you here. And Richard, it's been a treat to share this conversation with you, but I think, Gleaves, you want to moderate our questions?
Well, thank you, Hank, for asking masterful questions, and Richard for just being able to keep us enthralled to so many of these new surprising details about our 38th president's life. We do have questions coming in as far away as from Sydney, Australia. We have Troy Bramston from Sydney, Australia, wanting to know exactly when this book is going to be published.
Well, I can't tell you exactly, but I can tell you pretty close. It's going to be the fall of next year, 2022. Interestingly, June of next year is the 50th anniversary of the original Watergate break-in. And we had, well, at one point we were, but I'm not quite there. So it'll be the fall, I imagine September, October of 2022. But thank you for your interest.
John Lown asks, didn't Ford think that Nixon did not appreciate the pardon?
Privately, he observed in private that Nixon never said thank you for the pardon. Now, that's not altogether true, because I found there was a telephone conversation in which, after the pardon was issued and the uproar, Nixon called Ford. Now, we're talking about some Byzantine personalities here. Personally, I think Nixon called him going through the motions, but nevertheless, he said to Ford that he would return the pardon if it would, well, that's sort of like putting the toothpaste back in the tube. Needless to say, the political damage had been done. It is also true, Ford did not expect that it would be as controversial as it was. And one of the things that this book reveals is he had good reason to believe that. The fact is, there was a bipartisan effort on Capitol Hill involving some of the harshest Nixon critics, who basically said at the time that Nixon left office, well, if he will just leave, then we will make sure that, there's no prosecution. Now, Ford knew Capitol Hill, and I cannot believe that he was unaware of this. or that it did not enter into his calculations when he was, I mean, he knew it was going to be controversial. One of the things that also I reveal in this book, Elliot Richardson had a plan of how to go around the pardon. And he was literally, he was going to go public with this at a Washington press breakfast on September 10th of 1974. Well, guess what? On September 8th, the president announced the pardon. So it's one of many what ifs.
We have a question from Bill Howe about the 1976 presidential election loss. What did you see that Ford said privately about that loss?
Well, he said a number of things. He, first of all, it took him a little while to get over it. Privately, he said, "I can't believe I lost to a peanut farmer." That was an instinctive reaction that he had. And then, of course, you know, he'd go through, people to this day don't realize 9,000 votes. If you could have selected 9,000 votes to change in Ohio and Hawaii, he would have been the victor. Now, he still would have been a minority president. And he took that very seriously. One reason why his campaign did not press for recounts was because, first of all, he thought it would be divisive. And secondly, he thought even if they were successful, he had still lost the popular vote. And to him, that was the ultimate test of legitimacy. So there were things that he thought in New York State, for example, if Bella Abzug had defeated Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the Senate primary, or if Eugene McCarthy's name was on the ballot, the Carter campaign had gone to the courts in the last week of the campaign and got McCarthy taken off the New York state ballot. Well, New York was close enough that if either of those two things had happened, you know, you could argue maybe he would have won. If Nelson Rockefeller had been on the ticket, might that have made a difference in New York and Pennsylvania, maybe Ohio? On the other hand, Bob Dole did exactly what he was supposed to do. He brought a disaffected farm belt. You know, at the time of the convention, Ford was behind in Kansas. I mean, for a Republican to be behind in Kansas, that's ground for panic. And Ford, Dole was put on the ticket. Basically, I actually have a very detailed description of the meeting at 3:15 in the morning. It ended at 5:15 without a decision, and they got together again. And there was a growing pressure to put Reagan on the ticket. Well, Ford didn't want Reagan on the ticket. Reagan didn't want to be on the ticket, but they were on the verge of having the convention, in effect, take matters into its own hands. So Ford got on the phone, called Dole, and then he called Reagan to let him know what he had decided.
Not to interrupt, but my understanding also from President Ford was that he never quite forgave Reagan for not campaigning at all for him, and felt that had Reagan gone to Cincinnati, for example, that might have been enough to turn the tide. But
you know, it's true. They talk about Texas, they talk about Mississippi, South Carolina. Reagan had enormous popularity in the South, and you could argue that. But your point about Cincinnati, and again, I don't want to rile local feathers. One of the what ifs is on the last day of the campaign, if Ford, instead of coming back to Grand Rapids for that great big heartfelt homecoming, you know, where 50,000 people turned out to see Jerry and Betty, if he had passed up that and instead gone to Southern Ohio, which is where Ohio was lost. Southern Ohio is more like Kentucky than Northern Ohio, and a candidate like Jimmy Carter, in part because of his middle of the road politics, even more because of his evangelical politics. We forget it was Jimmy Carter, not Ronald Reagan, who brought evangelicals into the political mainstream, made them so pivotal a factor. So anyway, you can argue it all over the place. It is true that Reagan and Ford, there was no love lost for a long time. It is also true that once President Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, Ford never again said anything remotely critical. And indeed, Mrs. Ford, I mean, it's interesting. The night of the nomination, Reagan laid down two conditions for meeting with Ford. One was, don't ask me about the vice presidency. And the other was, no wives. Okay, you can easily factor that into the equation. But it's interesting because likewise, Mrs. Ford and Mrs. Reagan were on the phone, at least once a month after that point. And I think, look, it's like the Carter, who would have imagined in November 1976 that 30 years later, the story would end. I've told people I was given the privilege of being one of the eulogists at Grace, and I'll never forget that you're in a daze, but I remember very distinctly the sounds of a woman weeping, and I looked over and it was Rosalind Carter, and I thought to myself, who would have imagined 30 years ago that this is how the story ends? I mean, that's just a marvelous story in itself of how the Fords, and both the Fords, the wives became intimate friends. And I do believe one of the things that brought Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter together was the fact that they had both run against Ronald Reagan.
Fascinating. Well, since there was this tension between Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford, it's interesting. I mean, it's been argued that the 38th president was the most conservative president we had after Calvin Coolidge. But what did Gerald Ford think?
Well, it's true. Ford never grasped the logic of the Reagan challenge. Forget the 11th commandment and things like that. He said, I keep hearing that I'm the most conservative president since Calvin Coolidge. He couldn't understand. You remember, we're all products of what goes before. And Gerald Ford had spent a career on the Hill, mostly in the minority, and believing that success was influencing the majority, influencing the outcome of a bill, and convinced that the bulk of the American electorate was in the middle, or at the very least, they were not at the extremes. And in 1975 and 76, he looked at Reagan and his followers, the Jesse Helms and the Phyllis Schlaflys, and he thought, these people are undoubtedly sincere in their convictions, but they could never win an election. They could never win a national election. And so with that frame of mind, he was understandably more than perplexed at the now. On the other hand, Ronald Reagan believed very sincerely. The Republican Party is a hierarchical party. People stand in line, they take a number, and eventually the number gets called and they get the nomination for president. It was his turn, that he was the logical sequel, if you will, to Nixon moderate conservatism. And so he had to convince himself, in order to justify in his own mind, breaking with the 11th commandment that said, thou shalt not speak ill of another Republican. But he convinced himself that Gerald Ford was somehow not legitimate, that he was a historical accident, that he wasn't up to the job. I mean, he had to convince himself of all of this in order to run. And well, as you can imagine, that did not make for friendly feelings during the campaign or for a long time after the campaign. One thing I have to say on the macro sense, as I said, we did 160 interviews for this book. And we spent 2 days interviewing Stu Spencer. Stu Spencer is a legendary figure. He is one of the people who invented the art of political consulting in California. He was close to Reagan. He ran the Rockefeller campaign against Goldwater in '64. He ran Reagan's campaigns for governor. And in '76, he committed treason because he ran the Ford campaign. And it's really Stu Spencer who pulled Ford back from the brink in New Hampshire and Florida. Incredibly wise, observant man. And he said something that has immediate and continuing, in some ways, depressing relevance. He said, along about '76, the media decided that process mattered more than ideas or issues. And you start thinking, I mean, it really began with Teddy White and the Making of the President series. And then you had Joe McGinnis and obviously Woodward and Bernstein and other authors who put themselves in the middle of the story. Forget the kind of classic objectivity, detachment. By 1976, the candidates were not calling the shots. They were not writing the narrative. So when Jimmy Carter gave an interview to Playboy, or when Gerald Ford prematurely liberated Poland, for weeks, that became the national conversation, whether people cared about it or not. And they did care about it, but it wasn't as important to the average voter as it was to a lot of political journalists. And that divide, it seems to me, is another point of origin for so much of what has happened in the years since, and the evolution of political journalism along ideological opinion making lines. It began in 1976.
We have an interesting question from Brian Corbin, who's going to fit right into this theme of, friendships and tensions with political rivals, even of the same party. But how about somebody from the other party? Brian asks, Ford, of course, served on the Warren Commission. What was his relationship with JFK like?
It's interesting. One of the reasons why the Warren Commission was so difficult was because he had a personal relationship. He actually had an office in the House office building next door to JFK. Very different people, obviously, stylistically. They used to ride the subway over, together and vote. And usually their votes would cancel each other out on domestic issues. However, they were part of the World War II generation, the Cold War generation. And they were, it's really interesting. When Kennedy became president, then as now, the biggest orphan in the budget is foreign aid. You take a poll on the street, people think 40% of our budget goes to foreign aid, when in fact it's more like 0.4%. But nevertheless, then as now, foreign aid has very few friends. And in fact, that included, there was the head of the committee, the Democrat who headed the Foreign Relations Committee, or responsible for foreign aid in the Kennedy administration, said, if I had 5 minutes to live, I would kill the Peace Corps. I mean, that gives you an idea of what JFK was dealing with. Well, he did something that we can't imagine today. He went to the loyal opposition, and specifically to Gerald Ford, who by that point was a very highly regarded expert on defense issues and foreign aid, because he'd been doing it since the Eisenhower administration, and he'd been a strong supporter. And Ford bucked his own party's leadership and signed on with the Democratic president. And together, they managed to scare up enough votes that JFK got most of what he wanted in that year's foreign aid request. So there were a number of instances like that. Remember the famous dinner at Mount Vernon for the Prime Minister of Pakistan? It was one of an administration that is remembered as Camelot. Well, this was, the highlight of Camelot. They went down the Potomac and they had a tent set up, and they had the Marine band playing out on George Washington's Bowling Green. And the interesting thing is, when they were done with the dinner and this, magical evening, and the Fords are getting on their ship, their boat, which also, by the way, had Vice President Johnson. And JFK says, Jerry, Betty, come over here, come with us. And Betty Ford spent the rest of the evening dancing all the way back to the dock in Washington, including with the president. Well, JFK knew where his bread was buttered. He knew that it would serve his interests, his agenda, to keep Gerald Ford inside the tent, as it were, rather than outside. So I mean, that gives you, some idea of the working relationship. One other very quick surprising revelation. I won't go into the details, but Gerald Ford had much more of a role in the Cuban Missile Crisis than we have ever known. And it's one of the things I was really surprised to learn. And I think readers will be too.
Oh, Richard, you know how to tease us. Here's a question from Brian Steenbergen. How serious was Ronald Reagan's offer of the vice presidency in 1980?
There's a very good, and I haven't written that yet, but I will tell you, I'm deep in it. There's a strong case to be made that it was all a feint, that Reagan very shrewdly knew that it would be in his interest to be perceived as more moderate than a lot of voters perceived him to be. So by putting out this feeler, and very public, about considering Gerald Ford as his running mate, his polls show the one candidate who would add to his numbers was, in fact, Gerald Ford. President Ford believed, I think it's safe to say, were there serious discussions? Henry Kissinger thought they were serious, and Alan Greenspan thought they were serious. I don't know how serious they were at the candidate level. At the end of the week in Detroit, and this is from someone who was there with him, he got on the plane, a private plane, with this person. He said, well, he put his feet up. He said, well, we had a pretty good week. I gave a good speech, and we got George Bush on the ticket. And he was very pleased with himself. And it's one of those kind of mysterious, you could argue it either way, that we may never know a definitive answer.
This last question, I've got to say and apologize to all of our viewers. We have so many great questions coming in, but we're running short on time now. But this last question is really excellent. It's, what is the revision of Gerald Ford's legacy going to be based on your book, do you think?
Well, yeah, first of all, I'm flattered that anyone would think that one book could produce. What I hope the book will do is get people to see Ford not as a caretaker president, nor even as a kind of feel-good, post-Watergate cleanup president, but as a president who, in fundamental ways, anticipated much more of our political, economic, even cultural history than he looked back. I would argue that there's more continuity between the Ford and Reagan presidencies, and in some ways between the Ford and Carter presidency, but in some ways Ford, Carter, and Reagan. If you look at, for example, arms control, Ford and Leonid Brezhnev, in the first months of the Ford presidency, negotiated a basic framework. Now, for political reasons, they were not able to cement a formal treaty. But guess what? Presidents Carter and Reagan both observed the limitations in the framework. And then, of course, Reagan went several steps further, and we had the INF Treaty and significant reduction. There's just much more history being made by Gerald Ford. And there are seeds being planted, which not all of them sprouted, not all of them blossomed, but I think he's just again, to use the word, he's a more consequential president. It's a mistake to think of him as a byproduct of Watergate. It's perfectly understandable why, people have thought that all these years. If there's a revisionist element in my book, it is while telling the story of Watergate in a way that maybe has never been told, to realize that that's only half of his historical function. He was out at Vail early in his presidency, and the dog relieved itself on the floor, and a steward rushed to clean it up, and Ford brushed him away. He said, "No man should have to clean up after another man's dog." Well, in a sense, that's what Gerald Ford spent the first half of his presidency doing, cleaning up after a herd of other men's dogs. And we haven't mentioned the CIA, remaking the CIA, exposing CIA wrongdoing before it could be remade. With Gerald Ford, who issued the executive order ruling out assassination of foreign leaders. All of that, but that gets to the second half of Gerald Ford's historical function, which is having sort of cleaned up the messes, Vietnam and the CIA and Watergate. The second half of his mission was, in effect, to look down the road, to ask pointed questions about the role of government in the economy, inflation versus unemployment, peace in the Middle East, negotiating a stand back, which was the grounds, laying the grounds for Jimmy Carter's success at Camp David. When they left Camp David, they were in the helicopter, President Carter and President Sadat, and they made one phone call. They called Gerald Ford because they knew that it had begun under Gerald Ford. Well, it's the beginnings under Gerald Ford that perhaps go to the heart of your question about what it is that's different about my portrait.
Hank, do you have any final questions or thoughts?
Only that, like so many in the audience tonight, I am really looking forward to those final chapters and to September or whenever it is in 2022 when we get to heft that volume. Richard, thank you so much.
Thank you, Hank. Thank you for everything.
Well, on behalf of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library, Museum, and Foundation, thank you, Richard Norton Smith, and also Mike Ford and Hank Meyer for another powerful presentation to our friends of Ford. Richard, when your book does come out 1 year from now, we'll want to have you back to talk about even more of these wonderful elements that you are uncovering in President and Mrs. Ford as well, the administration, but also in their private lives, their inner struggles. Ford's ascent to the vice presidency and the 38th presidency, fascinating as that story is obviously only one element of this. Well, insightful, engaging speakers like Richard Norton Smith are what make the Ford special. If your mind was enriched by this evening's program, if your perspective was challenged or changed, then we hosted a successful program, and we hope you will consider becoming a friend of Ford. To sign up, please visit our website at geraldrfordfoundation.org, geraldrfordfoundation.org. There you will find exciting upcoming programs. The Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation Library and Museum is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, this month in particular. And we invite you to join us tomorrow, for example, Friday, September 17th, Constitution Day, from noon to 7 p.m. for a birthday bash celebration on the plaza outside the Ford Presidential Museum. So, till then, take care.